The failure of Germany in the final days of the Second World War was attributed to the decline of the German military. Berlin was the final epicenter of the liberating Soviet Red Army and the German sacrificial defenders, who fought to the bitter end for Adolf Hitler's unheeding Third Reich. In the very center of the big city, generals, soldiers, and even ordinary citizens had been involved in the hopeless position of stopping the Soviets in the battle which would determine the destiny of the Third Reich. The most critical commanding officers who defended Berlin were Helmuth Weidling, Wilhelm Mohnke, and Hans Krebs. These individuals were tasked with commanding some troops against heavy artillery units of the Soviet army. These commanders faced harsh realities as the Red Army encircled Berlin and closed in on its final conquest. But what happened to these men after the fall of Berlin? Were they able to reconcile with the devastation they had helped to create, or did their fates reflect the price of loyalty to a doomed cause? Today, followers, we will see the tragic ends of captured Berlin defenders who belonged to Hitler's formation of superior generals. Helmuth Weidling, the last commander of Berlin's final defense. General Helmuth Weidling was the last of the German commanders to be in charge of the defense of Berlin at the time when Berlin fell in May of 1945. The Soviets had finished the process of subjugation, and Berlin was no more a city but a heap of devastation. While the city was gradually surrendering to destruction, Weidling became the symbol of the last days of the Battle of Berlin and Nazi Germany. However, in the post-war era, his days would be encompassed by imprisonment, interrogation, and subsequent time of contemplation of the damages that the long and devastating war caused. During the ending phase of World War II, Weidling was appointed as the defense commander of Berlin to withstand Soviet forces. On May 2, 1945, as the Red Army was approaching the Reich capital, Weidling tried to surrender. He was captured at the end of the war, and subsequently underwent his ordeal at the hands of the Soviets. For quite some time, Weidling was moved to the captivity of the Soviets, and for several months he was being interrogated and tortured severely. Unlike other Hitler's associates with the similar rank of the Nazi Party, Weidling was not arrested and tried as a war criminal in Nuremberg. Yet he was a part of the defense of Berlin as well as the service to the Nazis, and was considered responsible for all this in the eyes of the Soviets for the final defense of Berlin. Their living conditions, together with other officers captured by the Soviets, were deplorable. He was consequently confined in a succession of concentration camps, whereby he had no option other than to undergo a life of severe hard work, surveillance, and brutalities of the mind. The Soviets saw him as a Nazi militarist, and his post-war life was entirely of effort to come to terms with what he had done during the war. However, such people as Weidling, who tried to free themselves from the Nazis' ideology after Hitler's death, could not escape the embarrassment of serving the regime. After the war, Weidling spent the rest of his life reflecting on the state of a country that was destroyed while he was commanding the troops in Berlin. The pride of a German officer was replaced by the realization that loyalty to the regime came with a heavy price of suffering. In his final years, Weidling never really came to terms with the part he had played in the war, and his name, like the city of Berlin itself, became synonymous with defeat and the vicious aftermath of the Third Reich. Helmuth Weidling died in 1955, aged 64, a bitter, disillusioned man. His life after the war proved that the long shadows of Berlin's collapsing and the idea that a man had been left alone to bear the war's burden of guilt and defeat was a new kind of redemption. Hans Krebs, the tragic chief of staff who witnessed Berlin's final collapse in 1945. During the Führer bunker period on April 30, 1945, the Red Army surrounded Berlin. Down in the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, the unfortunate and still battle-hardy General Hans Krebs remained one of the few remnants of the ordinary cadre accompanying Adolf Hitler. Krebs's role in Berlin's defense and his unconditional support for Hitler set the stage for his tragic fate. When, in March 1945, Hans Krebs was named the head of Army General Staff, he was at the helm of the sinking ship of Hitler's dream. By this time, the German forces were collapsing, and Berlin, the capital city of Germany, turned into a war zone. Despite his knowledge of the total futility of all the attempts being made for the German cause, Krebs continued with his work. When Soviet artillery shelling began to pound Berlin, Krebs worked out of the bunker to keep Hitler apprised of the situation. In these circumstances, Hitler decided to commit suicide after reading the news about Benito Mussolini's execution on April 30th. Late in the evening of the following day, Hitler and his companion Eva Braun committed suicide, leaving Krebs and others to recompose themselves. Krebs was sent to look for an armistice in the hours immediately after Hitler's death. Shortly after dawn on May 1st, he left the shelter to confer with the Soviet commander, General Chuikov. Krebs, who spoke Russian without a foreign accent, had a message that called for a ceasefire. But even those were in vain. The Soviets only demanded an unconditional surrender. Imposing the lousy news, Krebs arrived at the bunker. By then, anarchy was already ruling in Berlin. House by house, Soviet troops were moving deeper into the city, and the defenders were all but wiped out. In the bunker, hope was extinguished further. The propaganda minister of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, stated publicly that he would commit suicide after Hitler. When it dawned on May 2nd, the situation could not be salvaged. Other officials, including Krebs, also preferred to die than to be captured alive. In the early hours, he committed suicide, similar to General Wilhelm Burgdorf. Their bodies were found later when the Soviet forces overran the bunker. Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's loyal enforcer and defender until the end. During the final days of the Third Reich, seated in the Führer bunker of Berlin, Wilhelm Burgdorf was confronted with the demise of the Reich that he had been faithfully serving. As chief of the Army Personnel Department, Burgdorf had always been an ardent admirer of Adolf Hitler. His tenacious outlook and strong propensity towards the Führer were well documented. Even in the last days of April 1945, he was faithful to Adolf Hitler up to the previous statement, following Adolf Hitler's orders at the time of the increasing collapse of Berlin. Berlin City was destroyed by April 30th. Soviet forces were pressing around the town and the German soldiers were retreating. Burgdorf was alive to witness Hitler commit suicide, together with his girlfriend Eva Braun in the Führer bunker's private living quarter. When the leader of the Reich was dead, Burgdorf and the others sought to sell his demise as noble, a move designed to encourage further adherence to Nazi doctrine amongst the now minuscule German following. With the arrival of the understanding that the battle had been lost, Burgdorf experienced a combination of surrender and lust for life. His claim to Hitler and the cause of the Nazis did not allow for thoughts of submission, as desperation gripped other people as well. On May 1st, Joseph Goebbels and his wife, Magda, poisoned their 6 children and then committed suicide. When Goebbels was eliminated, Burgdorf and several other high-ranking officials were left to determine their destinies. Just as the Germans did not predict the outcome of World War II, Burgdorf could not even consider the option of surrender. He and General Hans Krebs decided to stay free from being captured by the closing Soviet lines. Their decision was based on their conviction as well as utter hedonism and do-or-die stand in the Nazi regime. During the early morning of May 2nd, Soviet forces moved closer, and Burgdorf and Krebs set the stage for their last drama. They went to another room inside the bunker for them to make sure they would commit suicide effectively. According to historical writings, Burgdorf committed suicide with his pistol. Some hours later, Soviet troops overwhelmed the bunker and found the corpses of the 2 generals. They gave their lives for their beliefs and proved to Hitler, at least, that the fanaticism that had infected the circle of the elite was still very much intact and smoking in the final days of the Third Reich. The fate of Wilhelm Burgdorf was a sad story of a man who eagerly devoted himself to the service of a losing cause to the end. The brave decision to die in the Führer bunker and with fellow companions expressed both hopelessness and commitment that characterized the end of the Third Reich. In that way, Burgdorf went to the grave with the sea of other unfortunate, misguided souls who followed Hitler to the very end. Artur Axmann, the Hitler youth leader who remained loyal amidst strong Soviet invasion. In the aftermath of the failure of Hitler's regime and the capture of Berlin in May 1945, Artur Axmann, leader of the Hitler Youth, paid the price for his loyalty to Hitler. In the last days, he organized the young partisans for a doomed stand against the Soviets, a desperate belief in Nazi Germany even as the end was assured. During the Soviet invasion of Berlin, Axmann went to the south to escape from the Allies. During the chaos of the falling Nazi Germany, he was finally caught by American soldiers. His surrender was the start of a new phase of war for him. Similar to many other SS leaders, Axmann was arrested by the Allies and then transferred to the Soviet occupation forces. However, even though Axmann continued to support Nazi beliefs, he took quite a long time to perceive the war as terrible and the German defeat as final. He remained loyal to Hitler and the idea of National Socialism for some time, even though he tried to comprehend the failed end of the Third Reich. Axmann received 10 years of Soviet imprisonment, and much of his post-war life involved being held within a Soviet gulag. He underwent torture, including forced labor, questioning, and other very unfavorable treatments. The years of imprisonment made Axmann's experience a wake-up call, although he never denounced the Nazi Party. The time that he spent between 1945 and 1948 as a POW in the Soviet Union may have given him a lot of time to question his prior brutality as a Nazi. Still, there was no evidence that Axmann's indoctrination ever wavered. Axmann was released in 1955 after the prisoner exchange of Germans and Soviets. When he got home to Germany, he had to face the grim fact of a devastated country and the issue of denazification. Despite being branded a war criminal, Axmann was able to start afresh in West Germany after the war. His loneliness and denial of half of the evil that the Nazis possessed didn't cease at all. He kept a low profile for the most part and kept on making excuses for his wartime conduct, apparently, never too eager to come to terms with the horror of what he was doing for Hitler and the Nazis. Axmann remained rather unnoticed afterward until the end of his days. He also had a few legal problems but did not risk much public examination. These final years were ones of regret, but they would not be free of his past. After the war, Axmann's life revolved around the burden he couldn't shake off and the loyalty to a failed regime that caused so much devastation across Europe. Artur Axmann died in 1996. Ferdinand Schörner, the ruthless commander who fought till his last breath. After the fall of Berlin in May 1945, the brutal General Ferdinand Schörner had to enshrine and contemplate imprisonment. Indeed, Schörner remained loyal to Hitler to the end, and while the German forces thus put up fierce resistance during the Soviet advances, after the city's surrender, Schörner escaped south. Still, it was an odd trajectory, with the aftermath of the war not seeming to help him much. Schörner fell into the hands of American forces shortly after the end of the war and was later transferred to the Soviets, who held him prisoner for 10 years. Even during his stay with the Soviets, he endured a tough time. The Soviets, who for a long time saw Schörner as one of the most brutal representatives of Nazi Germany, subjected him to severe questioning and hard manual labor. The action taken by Soviet soldiers was repaying similarly to the measures that Schörner used during the war, though this time he was on the receiving end. Schörner's perception of the war and its role as one of their key commanders changed during his captivity. He never apologized for what he did, but at least the time he spent in jail allowed him to hear about and learn about the suffering the war caused. This nasty attack that alarmed Berlin was bringing down the long-suffering brutality of the Civil War. Schörner, once an arrogant and self-assured officer, started to feel the magnitude of his contribution to that destruction. However, he never regarded himself as anything more than an order-executing soldier. Schörner came out of Soviet captivity in 1955 from a 10-year imprisonment. After his return to Germany, he was again subjected to judicial inquiry, which led him to another 5 years' imprisonment in Germany for betrayal purposes. When he was eventually released, he more or less cut almost all connections with public life. However, he was still a very high-ranking official and had many questionable activities. He abandoned the German military's politics and reconstruction process and moved to private life. As many former Nazis sought to denazify in the post-war months and years, Schörner never spoke of his service to the Third Reich. His last years were lonely, and he never wanted to fully understand that he was controlling the Nazis of the war machine. Such was Schörner's legacy, who died in 1973, the commander who continued to fight on for his service members, for Hitler, and for a war that was going to be lost shortly. General Felix Steiner, the reluctant defender of Berlin amid Soviet onslaught in 1945. When Berlin fell in May 1945, General Felix Steiner, who was responsible for defending the capital, found himself disillusioned and alone. He was not ready to die for an ill-fated cause and faced the implications of being a part of the war. His defense efforts were unproductive and led to a sad end to his military career. Taken prisoner by Soviet troops just a few days after the fall of Berlin, Steiner was to remain in captivity throughout the following years. Unlike most other top-ranking German officers, Steiner did not have a Nazi bend. His affiliation with the Nazi regime had been somewhat problematic. He was an excellent soldier in Germany, but he had voiced his dissent on the policies of the Nazis, the SS, and the leadership of Hitler. Thus, he was not as apt to deal with the hate as others in his ideological camp did, but he was still a prisoner of war fighting in the extreme conditions of Soviet incarceration. Steiner faced the cruel realities of the prisoner camps, which was when he realized his mistakes. He was compelled to consider what was happening and the grave consequences the war had on Germany. In joining the army, Steiner considered himself a practical man who wanted to chase after the enemies and regarded his captivity in Soviet prisons as something that awakened him from the world of war. The fact that he participated in a doomed campaign for a commander whose politics he was getting to dislike was something that haunted him deeply. In 1955, Steiner went back to West Germany after his release, and for the rest of his life he lived there. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not enter a post-war military or political career. Thus, he retired from public life, leaving the people to let him live a more private life. For Steiner, the bitter days in the Soviet captivity and the great disappointment in the war created a sense of non-participation in the social life of the divided Germany. Living a life as a hermit, he died in 1966. General Gotthard Heinrici, the mastermind of Berlin's tenacious defense in 1945. General Gotthard Heinrici, a professional soldier, had to fight the battle after the fall of Berlin in May 1945. Even though he tried to shield the city from the Soviets, it became impossible to continue fighting them. Heinrici's leadership played no role in changing the shape of the war, and his post-war life had many issues. Heinrici had been put in command of the army group Vistula in March of 1945 with a mission that was just about impossible: to hold Berlin against the advancing Soviet Red Army. Despite odds, Heinrici again utilized his recognized defensive approach to slow down the Soviets, and for this reason he was respected even by his opponents. However, when the situation became critical, Heinrici began to lose faith in Adolf Hitler's unwillingness to comprehend the actual state of a loss. By the end of April, understanding that the battle for Berlin was unavoidable, Heinrici pushed for tactical retreats to avoid as many losses as possible, which went against Hitler's orders to defend every position possible. The pragmatic approach resulted on April 28, 1945, in his dismissal from the position of the commander of the army group Vistula. By this demotion, Heinrici left behind not just the active officer's pursuit, but also the direct connection with the crumbling hegemonic Nazi bureaucracy, replaced by General Kurt's student. When Berlin was finally surrounded, and the very identity of the Wehrmacht threatened, Heinrici gradually moved out of the line away from what amounted to the fascist suicide that was being conducted by Hitler and his faithful adherents in the Führer bunker. As Berlin was finally captured and the war was nearing its end, Heinrici escaped the horrors awaiting most Nazi senior officers. He managed not to be caught by the Soviets in the turmoil that surrounded the crumbling of the Third Reich. He surrendered to the British in May 1945. A disciplined military officer with no history of association with the Nazi Party or war crimes, Heinrici earned himself favorable treatment as a POW. While he was a prisoner, the Allies wanted information about German strategy and the condition of the Wehrmacht in the last stages of the war. Heinrici cooperated. He offered important intelligence information, but he also distanced himself from the terrible things the regime he was a part of had done. When Heinrici was released in 1948, he took to a pastoral life in the British occupation zone in Germany. He retired and stayed out of the limelight but cared for his family and went over his war experience in detail. Heinrici had no trials or prolonged investigations after the war, as was common for most of his peers. General Walther Wenck, the last hope of Berlin's desperate defense in 1945. A week later, when Berlin fell to the Soviet Red Army on May 2, 1945, Wenck and many other commanders were captured. The immediate post-war experience for Wenck was characterized firstly by his captivity by the Soviets. Other senior officers who played different roles in the war were more severely punished, unlike Wenck, who was a moderate figure. He was detained by the Soviets for a few years and had tasted forced labor and imprisonment. His military history was examined by his captors, who deemed him as necessary where he linked to the end of Nazi Germany's defense. Wenck had sufficient time to think about the disastrous outcome in the defense of Berlin while in prison, that his objective was in vain, and he had to learn the hard way that, however well-intentioned, he was adding to Germany's misery so they could be honorable till the bitter end. Wenck had always served as a dedicated officer, but the final result of the Third Reich's peace was evident in the last year of the enormous conflict. His reaction to this bitter reality was disillusionment, as the dreams of fidelity to the Führer and military chivalry became less important than the ugly realities of the final campaign. Wenck was released from Soviet captivity in 1948, and he traveled back to a divided Germany. He attempted to come to terms with his civilian life in the following years. After the war, he was never an official figure in German politics and rarely spoke about what he did during the war. Wenck led a fairly ordinary life. His popularity among the broad population associated with his actions during the defense of Berlin was never debated after being released from captivity. He passed away in 1982. The years after the war saw him have little to say about what happened when his troops took the Battle of Berlin. Again, as one of the last resorts to save the city, Wenck led a low-profile life after the Great Conflict. He is attributable to the fall of Berlin and the tragic outcome of Nazi Germany, and came to terms with the harshest of the facts in the Third Reich's final days. General Joachim Ziegler, Berlin's resolute defender during battle with Soviets. General Ziegler was responsible for the Nordland Division, which was to play an essential role in the defense of Berlin from the Soviet advance. This division, which recruiters knew to be made up of men of many nationalities, was almost entirely composed of Swedes, Norwegians, Finns and Danes, that is, Scandinavians, many of whom joined out of anti-communist fervor. Yet now that he had the responsibility for a superior ship, the High Command's puffed-up commander Ziegler immediately realized they had no real purpose. The Soviet advances continued, and by late April of 1945, they were surrounding Berlin. German forces were disorganized and disoriented. When the Soviets approached, Ziegler tried to mobilize proper resistance to the attack in the city's center. However, his division situation was critical, and the enemy was too strong to defeat. The Nordland Division was already in a wane as it struggled through weeks of exhausting battles, but this was far from enough. It was grossly under-equipped and outnumbered. By April 25th, Ziegler's forces reached the city's center and were compelled to occupy positions around the Reichstag and Tiergarten. These locations saw some of the fiercest and most intense fighting in World War II. Close combat was becoming increasingly frequent. Thus, in contrast with many other officers from the circle of Hitler, Ziegler did not respond to Hitler's attempts to emphasize himself as the final commander in Europe. He argued the need to replicate just about everything, including making tactical withdrawals in order to save what was left of his forces, as opposed to what the Nazi leadership was urging them, that is, to fight to the last man. Thus, while his down-to-earth approach made sense in the circumstances, he was at odds with the other almost hysterical SS chiefs and other uncompromising Nazis who were ready to maintain every position at the cost of human lives. Ziegler was fired on April 26th because, unfortunately, he was a pragmatist in the eyes of the remaining fascist leadership. It was high time to go for incompetent nonconformity with Hitler's exit strategy. SS Brigade's General Gustav Krukenberg succeeded him. He took what was left of the Nordland Division. After his dismissal, Ziegler wanted to escape Berlin because he knew the city would soon be destroyed. However, an escape to freedom was almost out of the question because the Soviet authorities had surrounded the region. Ziegler met his capture by the Soviets when he was nearly overwhelmed by the masses during the period of retreat. They lived in the country and were brought into a prisoner camp after he was captured by the Soviet Union and sent there. Like several other German officers of superior rank, he underwent privations and strenuous cross-examination. The fact of Ziegler's imprisonment is still shrouded in secrecy, but it is for sure that he probably died in captive, as other high-ranking Nazi commanders faced, being tortured to death for their crimes. The SS commanders, Wilhelm Mohnke and the Last Stand of Berlin in 1945. Following the collapse of Berlin in May 1945, Wilhelm Mohnke was taken by Soviet forces and put in jail until 1955. Unlike many SS officers, he was not executed but suffered through brutal imprisonment. Mohnke had lots of time thinking of his actions during the war. He suffered the losses that came along with the defeat of a fascist government. However, during captivity and when thinking about why Berlin had to be defended at any cost and, to the utmost extent, sacrificing numerous lives, Mohnke had plenty of time to realize that all such efforts were utterly pointless in the eyes of Hitler, since the attacks by the Soviets in the capital, which were unrelenting due to defeat looming over the defenders, organizing the final defensive stand was symbolized by Mohnke as blind adulation to the expiring tyranny. In the camps of the Soviet Union, he experienced forced labor and isolation, which deteriorated his outlook on the war even further. Gradually, Mohnke became disassociated from the ideology that previously dictated his command while still feeling responsible for the men who fought with him. Following his discharge in 1955, Mohnke returned to West Germany and endeavored to reintegrate into civil society. He was not prosecuted for war criminals, majorly because of the complexities of the post-war justice system, and more so because he was a soldier than a war criminal. However, unlike other SS officers who fought during the Second World War, Mohnke never offered an apology, making him questionable to other historians. The later years of the man's life were relatively obscure, and he did not want to talk about his time spent in Berlin and the realities of the Soviet attack on the city. Mohnke continued to live a quiet life after the conclusion of the war. He distanced himself from the limelight, and in combination with his scarce media presence, he refused to speak about the war in detail. He died in 2001, more than 50 years after the end of World War II. Conclusion. In May 1945, Berlin fell, ending the brutal regimes of Nazi Germany and the war in Europe with it. Unfortunately for most of the defenders of Berlin, the end was bitter and unyielding. Caught up by the Soviet Red Army, most of the officers were captured and made to be prisoners of war. Some of them, for instance, General Wilhelm Mohnke, with many others, spent several years penning in Soviet gulags, suffering dehumanized existence and being made to face their fate. These men, once devoted followers of the Führer, experienced physical endurance and the effect of their participation in one of history's darkest moments. Other officers had the misfortune of surviving and being forced to explain their role in the capital's failed defense. SS General Felix Steiner and Army General Gotthard Heinrici. Many of them were never prosecuted for war crimes, but the guilty conscience arising from the atrocities, especially in the last days of the war, indeed came to haunt their lives. Consequently, one can single out such forms of internally enforced confinement as incarceration, exilic marginalization, and self-incurred isolation to which the defenders of Berlin were inevitably subjected as a result of their failure to resist the inferior rule of a totalitarian state that had brought misery and suffering to multitudes. Their picture is a bitter remembrance of war and all its tragic implications, as well as of the futility of devotion to the lost cause.